First, I just want to say thanks to everyone for coming. My name is Thomas Masnick, and I'm an assistant professor here at UCSB of pre-modern Chinese literature. It's my pleasure to host today's talk, part of a series of talks exploring race in East Asia, sponsored by the East Asia Center at UCSB. And I also get to introduce our speaker today, Shao-yun of Denison University. So Professor Yang, on his faculty profile, is self-described as a third-generation Singaporean descended from Chinese immigrants. He was educated in Singapore, earning his BA and MA degrees from the National University of Singapore. He then came here to California for his PhD, which he earned from UC Berkeley, studying under such eminent scholars as Michael Nyland and David Johnson and many others. He went on to teach at Denison University starting in 2014 and was promoted to associate professor just last year. So congrats, Professor Yang. His first book, The Way of the Barbarians, Redrawing Ethnic Boundaries in Tang and Song China, was published in 2019 with the University of Washington Press. It examines how the boundary between Chinese and barbarian was challenged and reaffirmed in various ways from the 9th through the 12th century. The book has been widely acclaimed since its publication 2 years ago and will certainly become a landmark in the field. In addition to his book and numerous other journal articles and book chapters, Professor Yang has also created several interactive story maps online, which I find particularly exciting. These are Journeys to the West, Khitan and Jurchen Travelers in 13th century Central Asia, a Chinese Gazetteer of Foreign Lands, a new translation of part 1 of Zhufan Zhi. This is last year he published this, and Frontiers of the Tang and Song Empires, another interactive story map. These things integrate geography, visual artifacts, translation, and more to create a kind of immersive experience of important historical sources. They break new ground of what scholarly publishing could be, and I urge you to check them out. I think this is a really exciting aspect of Professor Yang's work. But he also has a number of other projects in the works, including Elements in the Global Middle Ages, Tang China in the World for the Cambridge Elements in the Global Middle Ages series, as well as a translation of a 13th century travel account of Mongolian and Central Asia in collaboration with Ruth Donnell and Stephen West. Today's talk, Thinking about Ethnicity and Race in Imperial China, draws on a volume of translated primary sources on race and ethnicity in Imperial China that he's currently compiling. So with all that said, please everyone join me in welcoming Professor Shao-yun Yang.
So thank you very much, Professor Masnick, for your very kind introduction and for inviting me to participate in this very exciting series of talks about race in East Asia. So let me just share my screen while wishing everyone a good evening or good afternoon or maybe even good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much for making the time to join me today, and I'll do my best to make this worth the while. So can everyone see what I'm seeing on my screen? So I'm going to continue, and if you can't see what I'm sharing, please let me know.
You can see.
So, okay, great. So I'm breaking my talk up into 3 parts, and the second part is going to be longer than the others. The third part is going to be relatively short. But I'm going to start by talking about the problem of defining race and ethnicity before getting on to the idea of reconceptualizing, like introducing new conceptual categories for studying Imperial-Chinese ethnic discourse. And then I'll end with making some recommendations for what we can do in the future. So here's where I'll start. So we have basically in the 20th century, for much of the 20th century or most of the 20th century, the social sciences and historians who studied concepts of human difference mostly relied on 3 19th century concepts that came from 19th century Europe. So these concepts were race, culture, and nation. I have kind of basic definitions of these concepts here on the screen. And these were European in origin, but they spread to China in the early 20th century, actually mostly via Japanese translations. So you can see that the Japanese were the ones who first originated these translations that the Chinese then began to use. But if you look at Chinese works on questions of human difference or identity today, you'll often still see these concepts, 种族 or 文化 or 民族. So although Western scholarship has tended to move on from this kind of trichotomy of concepts, race, culture, and nation. In China, they are basically still mainstream and standard, and historians there basically still rely on them to a large extent. Now, the result of these concepts was this sinological paradigm that was very influential in the latter half of the 20th century, called culturalism. So the basic premise of culturalism is that pre-modern Chinese identity was based on culture, not race or lineage. And it was therefore especially inclusive and had a very strong assimilative power over peoples who are not Chinese. So many historians, both Chinese and Western, since the 1930s have been or were proposing or adopting this idea of Chinese identity, right, as culturalist. And it served as a foundation for this narrative called sinicization, this idea that Chinese history is a story of the Chinese becoming more numerous and populous and expanding territorially by essentially assimilating other peoples that it came into contact with, right? So Chinese civilization was taught to have this power of assimilating and sinicizing, right, making Chinese of people that were not previously Chinese, simply through the idea that anyone can become Chinese. You don't have to be born Chinese. You just have to adopt the culture that the Chinese have. So the downside of this idea of culturalism was, as Joseph Levinson proposed in the 1950s, and other scholars after him often adopted this idea, was that pre-modern Chinese identity being based on cultural universalism lacked a coherent kind of national consciousness. Right? There was no sense of a Chinese nation because basically Chinese culture was civilization and was theoretically universal. Anybody could adopt it and become Chinese. So Levinson's so-called culturalism to nationalism narrative was basically that in modern times, essentially in the early 20th century, the Chinese had to basically shift from thinking of Chineseness as culture to thinking of Chineseness as a national identity. And they had to accept the idea that to preserve their nation, its independence and its sovereignty, its integrity, they had to actually change their culture. So it's often thought that that Frank Decatur's book, published in 1992 and then reissued in a new edition with some small changes in 2015, the discourse of race in modern China, made this argument that the culturalism paradigm doesn't work for pre-modern China, right? Because the Chinese did not distinguish between race and culture. The distinction between race and culture in pre-modern China just did not exist. But if you look carefully at the analysis in the first chapter of Decatur's book, right, Decatur basically is still arguing that the majority of Chinese were cultural universalists. In other words, even though they didn't draw a distinction between race and culture, the culturalism paradigm to him still applies. Right? What he's saying is that there were also strands of what you could call proto-racial or proto-racist thought in pre-modern Chinese discourse or pre-modern Chinese thought, and that these merged with Western scientific racist racism in the early 20th century when it was imported from the West. So in other words, racism did not have to come into China without any prior kind of proto-racist elements among the Chinese themselves that could provide a kind of intellectual basis for the Chinese to then kind of merge them with Western racism. Now, since the 1980s, we have gradually, at first and then actually rapidly, shifted towards a new paradigm, ethnicity. Instead of the culture versus nation versus race kind of trichotomy, we have most Western scholars have begun to think in terms of ethnic groups, of human differences in terms of ethnic difference. So there's different definitions for what an ethnic group is or what ethnicity is. But a very influential definition is the one that I'm putting up on the slide here. Historical sociologist Anthony D. Smith defined an ethnic group as one that has these elements, or at least most of them. And as I state here, there are other definitions that are narrower, but also less widely used or less influential, but nonetheless, you will encounter them in some historical works where the argument is made that if it's not a politicized identity, that it's not ethnicity, it's only cultural identity. Or if it's not a politically marginalized identity, right? If it's not the identity of a politically marginalized or disenfranchised or disempowered group, then it's not ethnic. So I personally tend to favor the broader kind of Smith definition of ethnicity rather than the more narrow ones. But I recognize that there is some disagreement and some difference there. Now, one of the key points in the ethnicity paradigm is that ethnicity is based not on biological facts of ancestry. It's not based on what you were born as, but it's based on subjective and mutable identities. In other words, individuals and also groups have agency in choosing and even changing their ethnicity or their ethnic identity. And they can do so for various reasons, or they can choose not to. And nation is still part of this paradigm, but it's basically not all ethnic groups are nations. And at the same time, you could also say not all nations are a single ethnic group. So an ethnic nation is an ethnic group that has been institutionalized and mobilized for political action through a mass public culture that creates and perpetuates ethnic solidarity across various differences, which could be socioeconomic in nature or political or religious or regional and so on. And such mobilization may involve, but does not invariably involve, nationalism, which is a modern ideology that prioritizes national identity and national interest over all other identities and interests. So multi-ethnic nations are a product of colonialism and immigration, right? So they do exist, but they often struggle to balance civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism, right? And try to kind of preserve a kind of multi-ethnic national identity in competition with ethnic national identities. So the effects of the new kind of ethnicity paradigm include the ones that I'm listing here. And it's been pretty influential and impactful in getting historians to rethink some of the assumptions that we made about syncretization, for example, or what Chinese identity means, or what Han ethnic identity is all about, right? But a question comes up, which is that given that ethnicity could encompass both cultural and national identities, what about race? Does race still belong in this paradigm? Does it still belong in this picture? Does it have a place? Is this concept relevant at all to pre-modern identity discourse, or is it just is it a product only of early modern Europe, and one that has no equivalent in early modern China before it's sort of introduced from Europe into China in modern times? Now, here, some of you who know about this article by Pamela Kyle Crossley that was published in 1990 may recognize that the title of my talk is actually kind of like a tribute or an allusion to this classic article. And Crossley, in this article, made the case that ethnicity is not all there is, even in early modern China. Right? So she says that in the Ming period, Orthodox thought of the Ming encompassed a concept of racial descent that was roughly consonant, similar to the descent group construct of race in early modern Europe. And she argues that the Qing state at first rejected this idea of identity, but then ultimately under the Qianlong reign, basically embraced with some difficulty this concept. So Crossley's model of Manchu identity is as follows, and I've basically explained it both textually and in diagrammatic form on this slide. She argues that over the course of Qing history, Manchuness went from being defined by a shared culture within the banner system to being defined by state-imposed human classifications based on myths of common descent, which she understands as race, to being defined by this shared subjective belief among Manchus in common descent, culture, and history, which she calls ethnic consciousness. And she said that the last of these, the ethnic consciousness, is a late Qing phenomenon that emerged in reaction to Han ethnic nationalism, which itself was a new kind of ideology that was emerging at the time. So Crossley says that unless we can still use the term race, right, rather than replacing it altogether with ethnicity, it would be impossible to distinguish this kind of change over time, right? That you would not be able to draw a diachronic kind of progression from culture to race to ethnicity, ethnic consciousness when talking about how Manchu identity changed over time. Now, despite Crossley's caution or kind of warning in this regard, since the 1990s, scholarly uses of the concept of ethnic identity have increased rapidly, while at the same time, uses of race as a concept declined just as rapidly. Right? And the reasons for that, there's mainly two of them. There might be more, but to my mind, one of these is that the use of race in scholarship has been tainted by the discredited kind of scientific biological racism of the West, right? And as well as its adoption in East Asian cultures. And also by the idea that the use of race to talk about pre-modern history is anachronistic because the concept of race did not exist before modern scientific racism was created. So just to give you some examples of how the ethnic paradigm has shifted the field and had a major impact in how studies of identity in Chinese history have been framed. Right, you have published in 2001 The Manchu Way by Mark Elliott, whom I believe is in the audience, and Mark Abramson's 2008 book, also a classic, Ethnic Identity in Tang China. So these works like these have basically cemented the ethnic paradigm as the kind of standard or the default framework for thinking about human difference, human identity, diversity, and so on in Chinese history. Now, here's where I get to the subject of critical race theory and what it could bring to this situation or this picture, right? Where ethnicity is the paradigm, race is rarely used these days and is seen as kind of anachronistic and discredited. So CRT, some of you may be very familiar with this, some of you may not. It's been in the news quite a lot in recent years, especially since last year. But as the slide says, this is a kind of theoretical school that originated among non-white American legal scholars in the 70s and 80s. So kind of slightly before ethnicity became a concept that was widely used in the social sciences over here. So it was influenced by critical theory. The critical theories focus on critiquing and changing, not just critiquing, right, but also changing societal power structures. And it seeks to explain the persistence of racial inequities in US society despite the successes of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So CRT argues that American institutions, including the legal system, are perpetuating white supremacy and white privilege through a mode of, it's variously described as structural, systemic, institutionalized, or societal racism, rather than allowing the meritocracy and equality that many claim to be the foundation of American society. So CRT views race as a social construct, not a biological reality. It does not kind of exist on the biological level, right? Human beings are genetically very, very similar, right? There is no genetic basis for believing that racial differences in human beings exist. But the fact that it's not a biological reality but a social construct doesn't mean that it doesn't have real societal consequences, right? And these consequences exist independent of the beliefs and intentions of individuals who may not kind of espouse racist ideas or believe that race is a real thing or think of themselves as racist, but at the same time may benefit from or be complicit in the systemic racism that does exist. So as you see in the last bullet point, CRT has become very influential in recent years, both in public discourse and in academia. But at the same time, increasingly, if you've followed the news, has been facing backlash from conservatives who accuse it of being, Marxist or anti-American in nature. So critical race theory has not yet had any significant impact in studies of imperial China or Chinese history. But in medieval studies, it's begun to shift the field in new directions as well. And one of the recent works that have played a major role in this is Xiaoyun Heng's The Invention of Race in the European Middle Ages. And shout out to Professor Heng, whom I believe is in the audience also, for since last summer, really kind of encouraging me in our email conversations to think more about how CRT could be relevant to thinking about identity in the Imperial Chinese context. So as Professor Heng argues in this quote here, race is kind of like, it's a name, one of the names that we have for a tendency among human beings to demarcate themselves through differences among them that are selectively essentialized as absolute and fundamental in order to distribute positions and powers differentially, right? And construct a hierarchy of peoples for differential treatment. So the main point here is that Xiaoyun Heng does not see othering or race making not just as a means of self-definition or identity formation, or identity discourse, right? But actually also as a means of creating and maintaining inequalities or inequities between human groups. So the emphasis here is on power, not just on identity, whereas a lot of previous studies of othering have really focused on how it's used to build identities in the group that's doing it, rather than how it's being used to kind of create inequalities and inequities or hierarchies of power. Now, in the field of classics, CRT has also begun to spark new conversations and new ways of thinking about identity and human difference. So Rebecca Kennedy is one of my colleagues at Denison. She's in the classical department and works on ancient Athenian law and society. And here in this blog post that she wrote in December last year, she kind of explains how race and ethnicity are not the same thing from a CRT point of view. So race is a technology, a doctrine of population management that institutionalizes ethnic prejudice, oppression, and inequality based on imaginary and moving signifiers for human difference. And these may manifest differently in different times and places, right? So in other words, race is not always based on the same thing, right? And so Kennedy argues that this is different from what we might consider folk ideas of race, right? Race as it's often understood in the American context or the modern context, which she calls kind of somatic or epidermal or bio-race. It's based on physical features like skin color or facial structure and so on. And so on the other hand, Kennedy says that ethnicity, when she uses that term, right, she's referring to basically ideas of shared culture, language, political affiliation, and so on that are not embedded within hierarchies of oppression that are legally enforceable. In other words, this is about identity, but it's not about power and oppression, right? So in order for race to exist, as scholars of CRT suggest, right, it must exist within a political order, not simply as an abstracted category. So, it is, as she says here, it's the power of a state or institutions to enforce social political otherness that determines race. Without it, we just have ethnic prejudice or ethnocentrism. So systemic racism exists in Imperial China. So this is a question that has not been, discussed widely in the field up to this point, but you can see some kind of preliminary gropings toward the question or the issue in, for example, this online article written by Magnus Fiskesjö, who's an anthropologist at Cornell and has been a very vocal critic of China's policies and actions in Xinjiang. So here in the article, which is titled, Racism of Chinese Characteristics, he argues that Chinese racism is also systemic, and it's rooted in China's history as an empire, right? And he says that this trend of racist prejudice is what we see in Xinjiang today. And he goes as far as comparing it to basically the Nazi final solution in Germany. So here's where I kind of find this interesting, but also have reservations about how this shows using this idea of systemic racism to explain Chinese history or explain current Chinese policy. He's equating racism to ethnic chauvinism and supremacism, colonialist thinking, forced assimilation on the ethno side. But the question here is, are policies aimed at erasing or weakening an ethnic identity by force equivalent to systemic racism in CRT terms? In other words, would a CRT framework, a scholar who uses a CRT framework, look at this formulation and recognize it as actually systemic racism, or is it talking about something else? In addition, are these kind of problems of ethnic chauvinism, colonialism, forced assimilation, ethnocide, and so on, in fact rooted in imperial Chinese history, or are they something newer and kind of qualitatively different from what we saw in imperial China? So here's where I move on to my second section. So basically 20th century interpretation of imperial Chinese identity can be divided into a few boxes or categories as I'm depicting it in this diagram on this slide. You have descriptions of some discourses of Chinese identity as cosmopolitan, right? And that's basically what you might call an inclusive idea of empire. And then you have exclusive ideas of empire, which are often called xenophobic, ethnocentric, or exclusionist. You have what I call inclusive discourses of identity, which are often called culturalist, cultural universalist, or Confucian universalist, or exclusive identity discourses, which are often labeled as racist or racialist or proto-racialist, or sometimes proto-nationalist, right? If that's the scholar using or doing analysis thinks in nation versus culture terms rather than race versus culture terms. And it's often claimed that the cosmopolitan or culturalist or universalist discourses were more influential or more dominant in the early Tang or Yuan or Qing periods, whereas the more exclusive discourses were more dominant in the late Tang or Song and Ming periods. Now, what I'm proposing here is to try out some new conceptual categories for talking about imperial Chinese identity discourse, and I'm listing them here in these boxes. So instead of these, right, instead of talking about inclusive and exclusive, basically what I'm showing here is that there are ethnic and super-ethnic ways of talking about empire and civilization, right? And these terms are not entirely my own. Confucian universalism, as you can see, is already on this in this framework here. But some of them are basically terms that I after years of being frustrated by the terms that were available to me, these are terms that I decided to coin because I felt that they were more accurate or more historically kind of grounded way of describing what I see in the sources that I am working with. Now, how do I define these terms? So imperial universalism is an ideology that ascribes to the emperor a mandate to rule over all peoples and lands with no natural limits to the extension of his patrimonial authority via territorial conquest. So Tim Brooke at UBC in recent years has called this the idea of the great state and argued that it comes to China from the Mongol Empire and didn't really exist in any kind of strong or coherent form in Chinese empires before that. But I actually would tend to disagree, and I think we can already see this discourse in the Qin and Han empires. They didn't have to get it from the Mongols, although the Mongols certainly used it quite strongly when they were ruling in China. Now, civilization state discourse is different from imperial universalism in that it identifies normative physical boundaries for the imperial state and interprets them as coterminous with a permanent heaven-ordained boundary between civilized, morally superior Chinese and morally inferior barbarians. In other words, you have these boundaries that are permanent and normative, and they should not be crossed from either side, right? However, in some versions of this discourse, barbarians may occasionally participate in and even rule over the civilization state, but they have to first adopt Chinese ways and become civilized, right? And in fact, even if they are able to do so, if they are incompletely sinicized, they can still undermine the civilization state's integrity and cause it to collapse. Now, ethnocentric moralism, those of you who read my recent book will know this term, but basically what it is a discourse that identifies Confucian morality as the essence of Chineseness, and it equates immoral behavior to a literal descent from Chineseness into barbarism. And if you continue being immoral, you could descend even further into animality, right? So what you have is a combination of an ethnocentric interpretation of morality in which basically the Chinese are moral and the barbarians are not. And a moralistic interpretation of ethnicity in which if you are immoral, you're basically not Chinese anymore. And Confucian universalism is actually not the same thing as ethnocentric moralism, even though the two of them, along with civilization state discourse, are often sort of lumped together or conflated together as culturalist or cultural universalist. So Confucian universalism is a discourse that views Confucian norms of morality and civilization, right? The so-called way of the sages, as transcending ethnic and geographical differences and attainable by all human beings. Now, one of the things I'm trying to argue in this talk is that Confucian universalism of the true kind, the true universalistic kind, is not actually all that common in Chinese history, and it tends to occur mostly under so-called conquest dynasties. In Chinese ruled or Chinese dominated dynasties or empires, you tend not to see it, at least not to see it very much, and instead you might get as far as ethnocentric moralism or the idea of sinicization in the civilization state discourse. But true, kind of real Confucian universalism is relatively actually rare in Chinese history. Now, finally, Chinese supremacism is an ideology that views a Chinese-dominated Sinocentric world order as morally normative, normal, and beneficial to both the Chinese and the barbarians, and conversely, a barbarian-dominated world as morally aberrant and catastrophic to all of humanity. Okay, so these are the concepts that I'm trying to use to analyze the sources that I've been working with in my source book project. And I'm happy to talk about these and their definitions more during the Q&A. But what I'm going to try and do the rest of my time here is to argue that these conceptual categories, right, these 4 boxes here, this new framework here still doesn't really kind of fully account for change over time in imperial Chinese history, right? It looks too static and too synchronic if we put them together this way. How did they change over time? Do they all appear at the same time? When is one more influential or more dominant than another? So basically you have to instead try and map out the kind of ethnic or identity discourses in different periods of Chinese history. And I've tried to do that in diagram form as well. So in the Han period, basically things are more simple. You have imperial universalism and civilization state discourse kind of competing with one another or interacting with one another. And I put in these boxes, in these diagrams, the different ingredients or subordinate discourses that I see in, let's say, civilization state discourse. And for reasons of time, I'm not going to kind of explain what each of these is, but I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A as well. In the Tang period, you still have these two, and but you begin to see more elements coming in, right? These are the ones that have in bold. And in the Tang period, one of the distinctive things about identity discourse in that period is that Buddhist universalism becomes something that sort of balances between imperial universalism and civilization state discourse. So again, I'm not going to go into these individual sort of sub-discourses or ideas within these discourses. But I'm just putting them here for reference. In the Song and Ming periods, it gets even more complex. Now, Buddhist universalism after the Tang is kind of still there, but it's marginalized. So I'm kind of just putting it onto the side. So that's a big difference between the Tang and the Song when it comes to identity discourse. You see that Buddhist universalism no longer has a strong influence. But you have some new elements coming out of civilization state discourse. You have ethnocentric moralism, which in the Tang or in the late Tang was still emerging. But basically in the Song and the Ming, basically I would say it's strong enough in its influence to be kind of put in the category of its own. And you have Chinese supremacism emerging in the Southern Song especially, and then becoming especially influential in the Ming period. And then in the Yuan and Qing periods, right, if you again map them out, it's different from what you see in the Song and the Ming. Imperial universalism, the gray here basically is my way of trying to indicate that in the Song and Ming, imperial universalism is there and is used in various contexts, but it's not as influential because it's kind of like it's balanced out by these three other competing categories that tend to sort of counterweigh it. In the Yuan and the Qing, imperial universalism becomes much stronger, and conversely, civilization state discourse fades away. It's not completely gone. It's still in the background. It sometimes will be used in certain contexts, but it no longer is as dominant as it was in the Song and the Ming, right? Chinese supremacism is basically marginalized or even censored in the case of the Qing, right? So it's still there, but basically it's been driven underground. And on the other hand, you have Confucian universalism, right? True Confucian universalism having a major impact in the creation of what I call a super ethnic Confucian identity, the idea that you can be Confucian without being Chinese, and the emergence alongside that of this multi-ethnic literati community, right? Literati who are not, who don't identify ethnically as Chinese, but still are kind of engaging in or participating in literati culture. And then you have this other thing here, which the term ethno-dynasticism is something that I took from Michael Chang of George Mason University. And it essentially is this idea that the rulers of the conquest dynasties did not solely have policies aimed at keeping a certain family or a certain dynasty in power, but also had policies aimed at keeping an ethnicity, an ethnic group from which that ruling family came in power, in a position of dominance as well. So you have internal ethnic hierarchies existing in the Yuan and the Qing. And in the Qing, it's a little more complex because you also have this idea of the banners. And if you read Mark Elliott's The Manchu Way, for example, right, you'll see that the banners are a big part of Qing identity, of the landscape identity in the Qing. And the banners are not fully just Manchu. They are multi-ethnic in nature, and they have legal privileges for basically members of the banners, right? So, but essentially you have in the Qing and the Yuan a kind of ethno-dynastic system, which I would argue is the closest that you get to what CRT argues is race, right? So if we understand race not as something based on biological descent, not something based on heredity, not based on the 19th century understanding of what race is, but based on the CRT, or critical race theory understanding of race as basically a mechanism or a system for creating and perpetuating, maintaining hierarchies between different human groupings, between different ethnic groups. In other words, ethnic hierarchies. These tend actually to exist in the conquest dynasties, but not in the Chinese ruled dynasties or empires. Now, the reason for that, and I'll try to explain that here. I actually had more of this on other slides in this presentation, which I can basically get to in the Q&A if that comes up. The reason for that is that even though essentialized discourses about ethnic difference and ethnic hierarchy, right, this idea that Chinese are superior and the barbarians are inferior, were very common in Chinese imperial discourse, right, all the way from the Han into the Ming, and as I'm showing here, they still exist in the Qing, but they're suppressed, they're censored, they're marginalized, but you can still basically see them sometimes under the surface, and they kind of come roaring back at the end of the Qing. The thing is that in terms of legal institutions and legal privileges, the Chinese dynasties did not distinguish between ethnic groups when it came to internal governance. So I'll try and kind of like show that here. Right, so I had a lot that basically I didn't have the time to really get into, but we can try and get into that later, right? So basically, as I say here, although imperial Chinese elites were prone to essentializing ethnic differences for rhetorical polemical ends when justifying the Chinese-dominated or sinocentric world order, and interpreting the proper boundaries of the civilization state, they typically did not institutionalize ethnic hierarchies legally among full subjects of the imperial state. So full imperial subjects were subject to the same laws regardless of the ethnic background. There were internal inequalities of power and privilege codified into imperial law, the Tang Code, for example, the Ming Code, but these were based on status groups, family structures, and gender, not on ethnicity. In other words, the Chinese state was technically blind to ethnic difference when it came to governing its own population. Now, this is a stark contrast to how it understood foreign relations. In foreign relations, basically there is this idea of a stable hierarchical world order, right, in which the civilization state receives tribute from inferior barbarian states, right? And if you're a Chinese supremacist, you believe that that has to be the way. If the positions are reversed and you have barbarians dominating the Chinese civilization state or receiving tribute from the Chinese state, then basically all hell will break loose. You have anarchy unleashed upon the world. So the Chinese foreign relations discourse is extremely hierarchical along ethnic lines. But Chinese discourse, when it came to internal governance, was not interested in these ethnic hierarchies. Now, the kind of converse is true for conquest dynasties. Basically, you have dynasties that are very universalistic when it comes to talking about who can rule, who can be civilized, who can become civilized, who can be a Confucian, and so on, right? Who has the moral power, the moral charisma to be fit to be emperor over the civilization state or over the Chinese empire. But at the same time, and this is always, not a part of, public or state discourse, but it's always there in the background. You have this idea that there have to be special privileges, there has to be more power on the side of the ruling ethnic group, whereas other ethnic groups must be kept subordinate and be prevented from kind of overwhelming or overpowering the ruling ethnic group, because the ruling ethnic group is a minority in a state where the majority would tend to kind of drown it out, overwhelm it, assimilate it, if they were not, kept in a position of less privilege and power than the ethnic group that is in charge. Okay, so let me just quickly end, right? So basically I had all these 10 points here on my current positions to kind of like lay out in more detail what I'm talking about here. And I had all these quotes from various thinkers, and I might be able to pull them up in our discussion, right? But basically my recommendations here, there's 5 of them, and I'll quickly go through them, and then we'll go to Q&A, and we'll see what we can get out of that. My first recommendation is that this competition between imperial universalism and civilization state discourse in imperial Chinese history deserves more attention from historians. So we have had scholars and politicians or policy commentators who claim that China has always been a non-imperialistic civilization state. Now, I think that these claims are mostly ahistorical and presentist. But at the same time, we also should recognize that civilization-state discourse in imperial Chinese history has historically had a restraining effect on Chinese imperialism by channeling Chinese foreign policy towards symbolic dominance rather than military conquest or expansion. So there is that, even though I do think it's ahistorical and presentist to say that China has never been an empire, never been imperialistic. It's always just been a civilization state. Now, Chinese supremacism, this idea that I'm proposing here, and its roots in the idea of a stable sinocentric world order are best studied in comparison, I think, to contemporary debates in IR, for example, international relations, about the necessity of the US-led liberal international order, or, in quotes, Western civilization, as a safeguard against global anarchy or tyranny. Right? So Chinese supremacism had somewhat similar assumptions or claims about the necessity of Chinese dominance over the world. Right? Now, the CRT understanding of race may also be relevant here because the kind of hierarchy in international relations or in foreign relations that the Chinese supremacists insisted needed to be upheld also had ethnic elements. It was an ethnic hierarchy to some extent, right? But it should be accompanied by recognition that the symbolic sinocentric hierarchy in imperial Chinese foreign relations was typically enforced using, I would say, in effect, trade sanctions, right? The threat or the action of withholding the privilege of trading with the Chinese empire, right? And not military force. So in other words, it was not a very coercive form of dominance or hierarchy, even though occasionally it might military force might be used. And also that, as I explained earlier, Chinese ruled empires did not enforce ethno-racial hierarchies internally. Now, here's basically the last slide, and then we can go to Q&A. Right. So I would argue that the historical relationship between Neo-Confucianism and Chinese supremacism needs more scrutiny. Now, I would have gone into this in more depth and shown you examples if time had allowed me, but I basically always run out of time. Now, I argue that Chinese supremacism in the Song and Ming periods has very strong links, strong connections to Neo-Confucian thinking. Now, scholars have tended to overestimate or over-idolize Neo-Confucianism's universalistic aspects and to ignore its ethnocentric tendencies. Now, as I think I suggested earlier, in fact, true Confucian universalism tended to exist as an ideology only under conquest dynasties or among Neo-Confucians in Korea or in Japan. Right? In Chinese ruled empires, it usually only went as far as civilization-state discourse, which might include this idea of sinicization or ethnocentric moralism. But Confucian universalism, as I'm defining it here, really is more of a conquest dynasty phenomenon. Now, the interactions and tensions in conquest dynasties between Confucian universalism, imperial universalism, Chinese supremacism, and policies of non-Chinese supremacy and privilege, what I, following Michael Chung, am calling ethno-dynasticism, would be a fruitful subject for further research. And here, I think actually insights from CRT could be very useful if they're applied with care. Now, lastly, this goes back to the quote from the online article by Magnus Viskershow. I think that current PRC policy in Xinjiang should be recognized as driven mainly by modern ideologies, these being Han nationalism, assimilationism, and colonialism. Despite superficial similarities that may be visible, right, or that may be noticeable to older civilization-state discourses of civilizing the frontier so that the normative boundaries of the civilization state are basically kept intact, right? So if we have barbarians on our side of the boundary of the civilization state, we have to civilize them so that the boundary actually kind of works. Now, so despite these superficial similarities, I think that trying to root, what could arguably be called genocide or ethnocide in the case of Xinjiang in imperial-era ideas may be counterproductive if it normalizes or naturalizes such acts as a part of, traditional Chinese political culture. So we have, I think, an increasing trend in Chinese political discourse, nationalistic discourse right now of claiming that Western liberal ideas are not necessary and not needed and not compatible with Chinese culture, right? So if we kind of go in this direction of claiming that traditional Chinese imperial political culture was the root of what is happening in Xinjiang, that may actually not be a beneficial way to proceed, because it may well justify the Chinese in saying that, you know, this is how we did it back then when we were an empire. You know, Chinese, you know, synicization has always worked this way. So there's nothing wrong with doing it. No, I mean, and the West just doesn't understand our history and our political culture, and therefore thinks that there's something wrong with it. So, you know, thank you very much for listening. As I think you've seen, there was a lot more that I would have loved to share. And, you know, during the Q&A, we might be able to get to some of these examples and, you know, more detailed points that I had. But I think I'm going to stop here in the interest of time and kind of let the audience start asking questions or making suggestions or comments. So thank you very much for listening patiently. I look forward to talking about this with you.